All right, let's dive right in. We're going back to 19th century India, a time of just massive change. Imagine these ancient traditions, things that have been around for generations, suddenly slamming up against a whole new wave of ideas. And this wasn't just some polite debate. We're talking about a battle for the very soul of a society. And that really gets to the heart of what we're talking about today. I mean, how do you change a tradition that's existed for centuries? When a practice is so deeply woven into the fabric of culture, of family, of religion, where do you even start to challenge it? And, where does that push for change actually come from? What does it take to make it stick? And that's exactly the scene we're looking at. This was no quiet academic discussion. Nope. It was a full-blown struggle. You had traditions that had governed life for forever, it seemed. And on the other side, you had this new, determined group of reformers, both Indian and British, saying, hey, maybe it's time for a change. So let's get into some of the most intense of these battles. Okay, let's kick things off with what is probably the most dramatic and widely known practice, the fight against sati. So first things first, let's be really clear on what we're talking about. Sati, this was the custom where a widow would take her own life on her husband's funeral pyre. And you have to understand, this wasn't some rare, isolated thing. The sources tell us it was a pretty widespread practice across the major British-controlled regions at the time. And this is where you start to see organized opposition bubbling up. A really key figure emerges from within Indian society itself, a reformer named Ram Mohan Roy. Now, he didn't just quietly disagree. No, he took it public. He used his journal to argue against the practice, and he directly debated its most vocal supporters. He was not backing down. And this timeline really shows you that this change didn't happen overnight. Not at all. It was a gradual, hard-fought process. You can see the government first trying to just regulate the practice back in 1813. Then you have Ram Mohan Roy's public debates building up steam through the 1810s and 20s. But here's the crucial point. By 1829, the combined pressure from Indian reformers and missionaries had become so strong that the government finally passed the regulation to formally abolish sati. So, okay, the practice was banned in 1829. You think that's the end of the story, right? Well, it's far from over. Now, I want you to look at this date, 1987. Yeah, 1987, more than 150 years after it was outlawed, the death of an 18-year-old widow named Rup Kanwar in Rajasthan sent absolute shockwaves across India. Her case sparked this massive public outcry, and it proved that the custom, even though it was illegal, had not been completely erased. This led to a new, much stricter law, and it was this really stark reminder that just passing a law doesn't always mean a deeply rooted practice is gone for good. So while that fight against sati was happening very publicly, another battle was being fought, a much quieter, but just as tragic, war against the practice of female infanticide. So you have to ask, why was this even happening? Well, our sources point to these really powerful social and economic pressures, especially among certain groups, like some Rajput clans. You had the custom of dowry, which could make having a daughter a huge financial burden on a family. The difficulty and the sheer expense of arranging their marriages led some people to this horrific practice of killing female babies right after they were born. And the response here, it shows a really similar pattern of slow, gradual change. It didn't start with some big law from London. Instead, it started right there at the local level. You had officials like Jonathan Duncan securing written promises from clan leaders way back in the late 1700s. A few regulations followed, but look at the timeline. It took decades before these laws were actually enforced with any real teeth. And you guessed it, here's that recurring theme again. Those early laws, they just weren't enough. The practice kept happening. It literally took decades of sustained pressure, especially from Christian missionaries and other social reformers, to finally get a more comprehensive, dedicated law on the books, the Female Infanticide Prevention Act of 1870. Okay, now let's widen our lens a bit. We're going to look at a global issue that had a very, very unique and complex story in India: the abolition of slavery. See, slavery in India wasn't just one thing. It looked totally different depending on where you were. In big port cities like Bombay and Calcutta, it was often tied to international trade, slaves being brought in from Africa and Arabia. But then you go to a region like Madras, and it was a whole different story. There, it was mostly agricultural slavery, something that was just baked into the local economy.
Now, what's really fascinating is when you look at where India fits on the global timeline of abolition. So, Britain abolishes slavery across its colonies in 1833. Makes sense. But the official act for India doesn't come until 1843. That's a full 10 years later. So, why the delay?
Well, this was the official justification, anyway. The East India Company, which was running the show in India, basically argued that slavery there was different. They claimed it was a traditional domestic institution, something that even had religious backing. And so they delayed, they procrastinated, and they treated it with this caution that they just didn't apply anywhere else. All right, so we've looked at sati, infanticide, and slavery. And after all that, we're left with what is probably the most important question of all. Where did the momentum for change actually come from? Who were the real drivers here? And this really brings us to the core of it all. Was this just a story of a Western power coming in and imposing its values? Or was there something more complex going on? Where did the real push for these reforms actually begin? Well, the answer our sources point to is a coalition. It wasn't just one thing. The pressure for change was this powerful combination of three really distinct groups. First, you had the Indian intelligentsia. Think reformers like Ram Mohan Roy. Then you had influential Christian missionaries. And finally, you had individual British administrators, guys who were actually working on the ground. It was this unique alliance that really created the momentum needed to get things done. So here's the crucial takeaway. The story of social reform in 19th century India is not some simple, top-down project that was just dictated from London. In the case of both sati and infanticide, the sources are crystal clear. The main push for change came from this coalition on the ground. It was driven by Indian thinkers, by missionaries, and by local officials all working together. And this brings us to our final, lingering thought. The legacy of these practices, something we saw as recently as 1987, really proves that passing a law isn't the same as changing the heart of a society. It leaves us with a really critical question. Even when you have powerful advocates, when reform is pushed from the outside, how deep can that change truly go?